Welcome to the world of Kimberton Waldorf School. My name is Brad Kirshner, head of school, and today I'm excited to be with Mark McGivern. Mark is somebody who I met a couple years ago at a conference that Mark actually helped to co-organize, and the theme of the conference was anthroposophy and social justice. And I met a lot of amazing and wonderful, thoughtful, dedicated people there, and one of them was Mark, and I was really impressed by what he brought and by the orchestration and the thinking and the intention behind the whole gathering. And so I've been sort of tracking his work since then and wanting to be in touch. So this is a great opportunity for Mark and I to check back in with each other and have a conversation. So welcome, Mark.
Thank you, Brad. It's really great to see you again. It's
Yeah,
been a
thank
couple
you.
of years, and
Yeah.
I always think about you and down in Kimberton and as the head of school there, and the nice culture that school seems to have brought. I really enjoy your website and all the resources that you've put up on it. Yeah, it's great. Well
Thank you.
done.
Yeah, thank you. We're trying and we're mostly doing well. And I think, since you and I connected some time ago, a lot has happened here in Kimberton, and we're really trying to, yeah, evolve our culture and cultivate our culture in a way that's really in alignment with these deeper anthroposophical principles that we were talking about together a couple years ago.
Yes. Yeah.
So with that, why don't you please maybe just share with us a little bit about yourself, sort of brief biography in a way that connects to, in particular, your connection to Waldorf education and or anthroposophy.
Yeah, will do. I'll try to make it brief.
Yeah.
Um, so I'm coming to you from Victoria, BC, which is at the southern tip of Vancouver Island and west coast of Canada. I grew up in Toronto and have lived in Canada most of my life. Um, I've basically been a teacher more or less since I graduated from university. I spent a little bit of time in teaching in Nicaragua first during the Sandinista Revolution in the late 80s, just before that revolution was ended. And have taught in various countries. I lived in Japan for a while, and then I lived in Dubai for 3 years teaching. Um, yeah, I look back on that really fondly, those days of living in different parts of the world and really feeling this connection with local parts of the world. I didn't just sort of travel through. I landed somewhere and sort of dug in and had real I feel a real kind of multicultural experience. It was really formative for me. And then I decided to become a Waldorf teacher when my kids were young and coming towards school age. I had been an anthroposophist, more or less, or I should say, interested in anthroposophy since my early days in university. And then when my kids became school age, I started to think, oh, I'm going to make a transition from being basically a language teacher to being a Waldorf teacher. So I did my training in Toronto in 2001. First day of training was 9/11. Interesting, auspicious kind of moment.
Mm.
And then I proceeded to work for 6 years mostly in the middle grades in in a school in Nelson, British Columbia.
Mhm.
And then I left Waldorf education as a direct teacher and took up other things, sort of Waldorf, and it was a Waldorf inspired high school that I became a part of. That was a hybrid online and person innovation in those days. So I got a chance to work with high school students, and I slowly became involved in Waldorf teacher training. So currently I work with the Foundations program at the Rudolf Steiner College, Canada in Toronto. So I work with teachers who are doing a Foundations program in preparation for doing a Waldorf teacher training. So get a lot of get a lot of opportunity to discuss this relationship between anthroposophy and teaching and
Mhm.
its manifestation in education, you could say.
Mhm.
And and yeah, I do a variety of other things now and keep my pulse on the Waldorf movement. I helped rewrite a part-time teacher training program out of Toronto for
Mhm.
teachers who are untrained and but working as Waldorf teachers, which is a I'm sure you're familiar with that phenomenon.
Yeah.
It's quite commonplace now that teachers are moving into teaching positions without a strong background in the philosophy and approach. So
Mhm.
it's something that this new part-time program is trying, and I think a number of places are trying now to meet a variety of needs around that. So, and in doing that, and also taking up some research and working with teachers on the DEI question and
Hmm.
its relationship to the identity of Waldorf education,
Hmm.
and seeing and seeing how and looking primarily, I think my work is to help focus on the resources that anthroposophy does bring to this question, which tends to not get looked at.
Hmm. Hmm.
And bringing that, and it's a real concern to me because I'm my feeling is like when you get into those resources and that point of view, largely under the frame of what you could call social threefolding, um, there's a real concern that unless we approach this question of social injustice from a social threefolding point of view, we're not really going to move towards um, a just society.
Hmm.
I think the insights that Steiner brings there are profound enough to really help us chart a slightly different course. So, I mean, yeah, doing that kind of work is kind of my most recent occupation at the moment.
Hmm. Yeah,
Yeah,
great. That's very rich, and I'm glad you mentioned that early life experience too of living in different cultures. I think that those kinds of experiences are very important and very formative.
yeah. I lived for 3 years in Dubai, and essentially an Islamic country, and it was a profound experience because a lot of the expats who go and live in Dubai, it's a very expat heavy country. About 80% of the population is just imported people from other places. But most people don't get a chance to really work with the local people, the Emiratis. So
Mhm.
I had a group of about, well, a variety of groups of young men between 18 and 25, and seeing their world through their eyes was quite a rich experience. Yeah,
Hmm. Yeah, and it's relevant to our thinking about very questions about diversity, right, in culture, and
exactly.
and
Yes,
to be sourcing our thinking and our values and our intentions for those big topics and questions from the actual lived experience of diverse peoples and cultures, and not just from a subset of ideas that actually comes from a very sort of insular, more academic culture, right?
exactly. Yeah.
That's an interesting contrast. So maybe let's
Mhm.
let's get into thinking about, maybe you can share a little bit about, well, maybe just first broadly, thinking for a parent who maybe is not that familiar with Waldorf education yet, and all that you've sort of been through in your journey as a Waldorf teacher. What are some of the things that you'd want to highlight that are most salient and relevant and important as like the intention and what makes
Mhm.
Waldorf education sort of different and unique?
Well, thank you. Great question. One of the ways that I I try to bring a sense of Waldorf education to both teachers and parents who aren't familiar with it is this idea uh, that there's basically three things that are happening in a Waldorf education. There's an academic education, a social education, and an artistic education. And what Waldorf, the sort of, secret potion of Waldorf education in a way, is the way that it integrates all three of those. They're not separate. They're not separate activities that just that the teacher tries to touch upon and have a little bit of each, like going around and doing a little bit of each, but it's an integration of those things.
Mhm.
And in that integration, there's a very special experience that happens for the child, and it manifests in a whole bunch of different ways. Um, so each of those spheres, you could say like the social education, the artistic, and the academic, they all influence each other. So you'll find an artistic element arising within the academic world. And you'll find an artistic element arising within the social education. And I would say that a lot of parents um, are equally concerned, not just with the academic progress of their child, but particularly with the social experience of their child in school. That is being attended to, and not just in a when problems arise, but is attended to as a real pedagogical goal, right? And the thing about the artistic side is not so much, and sometimes Waldorf gets sort of pegged as this. as an artistic education, and children who are more artistically leaning, it's more sort of a better fit for them and whatnot. But really, what lies behind the artistic element is the life of feeling.
Mm,
So our art is only used. Now, obviously, their skills at doing art are gonna improve over time. Um, but the real focus and pedagogical purpose of the artistic education is to enliven the feeling life in children.
mm,
And so, and that rests upon a huge insight from Steiner that in those grades from grade 1 to grade 8, that's primarily where children are developing, is in their feeling life.
mm,
They're not they're not developing in their intellectual life as a primary focus yet. And the development of their feeling life allows them a kind of holistic um, sense of the world, a kind of feeling of love and connection to the world, upon which the blossoming of their thinking later can draw a kind of life force from, right? So that the life force that infuses their later thinking as adolescents, it doesn't just come from abstractions or theory. It comes from actual experience and connection to the world, which is seeded in through that artistic education when they're quite young. So the integration of all those things is a really special gift for your child.
mm.
And I don't know that you'll ever experience it in any other stream of education, which isn't to say that there aren't other positive streams of education, of course. But that particular integration of those three is, I think, something that's relatively unique to Waldorf education.
Yeah, thank you. I really like that description and the weaving of those three things together. And also, it speaks to the developmental nature and understanding of Waldorf in that there are these broader time periods of life, and to bring a certain sensibility to what is really most experientially salient for children in their development at different periods of their life, which can help keep us from just projecting or um, overly sort of putting ideas and practices and kinds of pedagogy and curriculum onto children that are not actually meeting them, right? And I feel like that's one of the big
Yeah,
problems seeing in education today is that the pedagogy and curriculum of modern, postmodern public education and even private education is not really meeting the feeling and emotional and relational and artistic needs of children, even if it's striving to meet their academic and intellectual needs, it's not meeting them where they're at as whole people and whole developing beings.
exactly. And one of the helpful ways Steiner helps us understand why that's the case, it's because um, uh, forces or influences from the economic realm and from the political realm seep into education. And that's why Steiner felt education really needed to live in what he called the cultural sphere, where freedom is an ideal, and and it's like almost like a kind of safeguarding of those other influences that tend to overtake the direction of education in order to meet political and economic needs in society.
Mhm,
So Steiner wanted to sort of have a barricade a little bit of to allow just a human developmental approach to live in there and not have the state and the economic actors influence that curriculum. Having said that, of course, he realized that in a certain way could be seen as an ideal, and compromises inevitably have to be made, but to be really conscious of those compromises and to soften them and to try to work with them uh, in ways where the child remains in the center of everything.
mhm,
It's a real beautiful thing. The other thing parents would get from a Waldorf education is the whole culture of the school is focused around even down to the governance of the school and the administrative structure attempts to be focused with the child in the children in the center of things.
mhm,
And I think that's I know a number of people who have their kids in public schools, and that can be something where that parents, you can come up against the administration or the hierarchical power structure or a variety of things that can easily, unless you've got really inspired educators, those priorities tend to strongly influence the what happens in the school. So that element of kind of cultural freedom really, Waldorf schools try to embody that and keep your child at the center of
Yep.
what's going on. And the teachers will be lovingly observing your child
Hmm.
and taking in uh, a deep sense of where they are developmentally.
Hmm.
And we know that missed developmental opportunities or developmental aspects of the child's being that don't get enough attention manifest later as further, learning disabilities
Hmm.
or even feelings of kind of cynicism,
Hmm.
um,
Hmm.
and the dry sense of how dry academic life can become, right?
Hmm.
So it's quite an investment to make
Yeah.
in your child's life.
Yeah. And that point of simply having the freedom to be in the cultural realm and to be trying to create an educational approach and environment that is really coming out of an understanding of education and development and not being influenced by external factors is just
Yeah.
um, it's not something we think about very clearly, I think, often, but it's so essential. And before I found Waldorf education, I was working in lots of different kinds of schools, and I spent some years working in public charter schools in Boston. And my experience at that time, being in grad school, trying to grapple with the history of education, the sort of educational industrial complex, the bureaucracy of being in public education, and just hitting these walls that where you could just see and feel that the bureaucratic infrastructure and the economic and political influences were were really exacerbating the situation for all the educators, and that the teachers and the parents were caught up in a system where they were not free. They simply were not free to do things the way they wanted to do them. And I think the experience of so many teachers in schools is one of a lack of agency and a lack of freedom because this really essential and simple point of needing education to be have that freedom in the cultural sphere of the world and not be overly influenced by other factors is so key and it's so missing. And once you separate yourself from that way and you have that independence, it sort of liberates all kinds of human creativity and energy and thinking around what really is best for children and just simply be able to bring that loving attention to children in their development and thinking about them holistically is really the bedrock foundation for any meaningful and effective educational approach. And
Yeah.
Waldorf sort of gets that in a really deep way, partly because of its grounding in this anthroposophical vision of social threefolding, which you're sort of alluding to. I'm wondering if we should say anything more about that, um,
Well,
or
can I give you an
or move on.
example of
Yeah,
an example again of
yeah.
what, in a way, what the parent gets
Hmm.
from a dedicated, inspired Waldorf
Yeah.
teacher, class teacher, or other teachers. So this idea of freedom, you can take it a step further. Steiner gave an interesting indication to teachers, and he said um, a couple of things about the responsibility of the teacher to not bring their own moral codes to children.
Hmm.
So this idea that I could have my sympathies and antipathies towards various moral stances in the world,
Hmm.
and and obviously each of us does that, and we feel quite strongly towards the moral principles or the moral codes that we do adopt, and because we adopt them because we feel very strongly that they're important and they're right. And of course, as a teacher, it can be very tempting to teach through those moral codes and then try to, in a way, bring those moral codes to children in such a way that they will imitate them
Hmm.
and take them up for themselves. But Steiner says even there, in terms of, this principle of freedom, you're not leaving the children free to develop their own moral inner impulses if you do that. Steiner says you should not, and in particular political ideologies, he said we must eradicate any sense of political ideology within a curriculum. And even further, um, any sense of our own personal moral codes needs to be not be brought, which can be confusing because you'd think that's one of the things that you would want to bring. But
Mm-hmm.
Steiner's insight is that moral code, when you impose or bring a moral code to children, that isn't the thing that makes them a moral person.
Mm-hmm.
The only thing that makes them a moral person is is what arises out of themselves in their feeling life. So any imposing of them, and even out of the, so you'd feel the tension, right? Like, but it's a good thing. Like this is an important moral code that I personally feel. So our sympathy for that is gonna it's gonna take a lot to sort of hold that in check and to approach um, uh, the to approach the child as a free being that will eventually, if they're held in a loving way and they're taught in a way that they can connect with the life of the world, and be inspired by it, their own morality will rise up out of themselves and not and with if only if it's not imposed by adults on them.
Mm-hmm.
So Steiner has a kind of vision of the real kind of radical freedom
Mm-hmm.
for your child,
Mm-hmm.
that they're not going to grow up with an imposed moral code that they then, as adults, have to struggle to make their own,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right? They're from the very beginning, they're going to be in a kind of cultural environment where that's going to nurture um, that's going to nurture their sense of connection to things, out of which a moral
Mm-hmm.
view of the world will arise. And Steiner was clear about one of the reasons going even further, one of the reasons he emphasized this is that before the time of puberty, he said that children should not be called upon to, their faculty of judgment should not be called upon. And it's only when they reach puberty um, that they can begin being taught in such a way to form judgments. And so post-puberty, the pedagogical approach to that is diversity of point of view. So Steiner would say that, for example, you would give kids, one of his famous examples was you would ask children in the middle school to reflect on some manifestation of modern culture, and that I think he used the steam engine at that time. And so to do a piece of writing or a project where looking at all the positive aspects of that development, and then another one looking at all the negative aspects of it, so that the child begins to uh, to to move past just their own opinions and form what Steiner would call sound judgment as the foundation for a moral point of view. So your morality just doesn't come out of a highly opinionated view of the world.
Mm-hmm.
And so quickly, just to show you this little picture, if that faculty of judgment is pulled upon before puberty, Steiner says it makes an impression in what he would call the etheric body or the life body of the child. And then that's where the child's temperament lives. And so if the child is forming judgments before puberty, those judgments will, in a way, go deeper into the child and be formative for them in a way that is potentially unhealthy when they're older. But if you wait until after puberty, where he calls what Steiner calls in esoteric language the astral body or the life body or the soul body appears after puberty, they can begin to form judgments then because the judgments live not deep in their physical etheric nature, but more in their feeling life, where they're more mobile and flexible. And that's the appropriate age to work with the formation of judgment.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a really deep sort of you know,
Hmm.
understanding of the human being that teachers can pull on to help the child really come into their own sense of how to be in the world and not have that imposed on them.
Yeah, that's very important. And I think in some ways, some aspects of what you're saying might be hard for some people to understand. And there's
Hmm.
also there's so many layers to how the developmental principle that you're pointing to, and also the pedagogical principle that you're pointing to, is interacting with some of the social, cultural, political tensions that we're living with today. So, right, that there's
Exactly.
interesting um, confluence of understanding developmental timing of when it's appropriate to bring certain kinds of thinking and judgment making to children. There's also the pedagogical principle of, as a teacher, not imposing your moral view to be modeled by young people. Um, and my sense is that remains true even as they get older. You're working with them differently as they get older and asking them to think and judge differently as they get older. But at any age, you're still also leaving the freedom to the other and not trying to impose your views on others. So that's just recapitulating sort of what you were pointing to. And I think part of what's hard for people to understand in that is that I think many parents and teachers nowadays are making the mistake of not really respecting and understanding that sequence, not having the patience and the clarity of knowing that waiting on certain things is better, and they bring too much too soon and in a way that is overly just overly heavy or imposing or something on children. So I think that's one of the things we're struggling with, but also we're struggling with this social cultural context where yes, many educators and parents are feeling in some ways overwhelmed or stressed out by some of the moral and ethical tensions happening in the world. And that leads them to want very much to give children guidance on certain things. And in particular, in relation to even specifically Waldorf education, like there might be things that people think, maybe we need to get more contemporary and more in the contemporary political conversation in the name of a sort of moral ethical ideal, right? Like we don't want to let our kids be left behind in this sort of old world bubble or something. We want to be bringing them into the contemporary world of like social justice and morality and diversity. But the ways in which we do that can cut against really what's best for children going through that maturation process to become the moral, thoughtful people that we want them to become,
Yeah,
right?
and and that touches into the idea of experience
Mm,
versus these moral codes we were talking about.
mm-hmm,
So the approach to that is mostly experiential, and
mm-hmm,
how people are treated. Are
mm-hmm,
people treated equally? You know,
mm-hmm,
and so the I guess the idea in Waldorf is that um, it's less the idea and the concept that's going to be formative for the children, and more their experience that's going to be formative. One
mm-hmm,
good example of that, I mean, in Canada, there's a strong emphasis these days on reconciliation with Indigenous peoples.
mm-hmm,
And so one of the things that's brought up is, or one of the things that can be done with younger children is, of course, experiencing the people directly, forming relationships with local Indigenous people,
mm-hmm,
um, participating in their festivals, having storytelling from them. So, and then out of that experience, um, more conceptual understandings of the history of what's happening there and whatnot can be undertaken at
mm-hmm,
an older age, right?
mm-hmm,
But
mm-hmm,
the, but what I see is slightly problematic, and this gets us into the notion of what's the difference between reconciliation and decolonization.
mm-hmm,
And one of my challenges with the approach, the pedagogical approach of decolonization, is that it does exactly what we were talking about. It forms a judgment about what is good and what is bad, and already, right, it's an adult formed judgment that is then sort of imposed on children. But to speak what you're talking about, we do want children, um, we do want to stand very, very, very strongly in the reconciliation place where children can when I was a child growing up in Canada, we never heard anything about Indigenous people. Never mind have even seen one, right? So there's a whole rich sort of pre-puberty time when they can be building up an imaginative picture through actual experiences with Indigenous peoples and their culture and participating with them and hearing from them, as opposed to hearing a moral code that says, for example, everything of Western culture is bad, everything of Indigenous culture was positive.
Mm,
And that's essentially what the decolonization message is that we have to take what a whole set of assumptions about the world that come from Western culture and get rid of those and obtain a new set of cultural assumptions that
mhm,
are more aligned with the nature of indigenous culture. So there's an inherent judgment there that we want the children to not necessarily undertake. It's not necessarily an accurate portrayal of the world either.
mhm.
But what we want for them eventually, particularly post-puberty, is to see things from this diverse point of view. And then they build sound judgment upon which their moral life can be active in the world in a moral, socially responsible manner, right? So I see
Yeah,
what you mean. There's a variety of influences and tensions, and it's a question of how do you unfold that as opposed to impose it.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, another really excellent distinction, just really always keeping front of mind and highest priority as an adult with students what their actual experience is and not having it be too abstract and putting too many overly simplified, overly reductionistic judgments and abstractions onto children and sort of asking them to reinterpret their experience through those abstractions as opposed to developing their ideas out of their experience.
Exactly. Right. I really agree with you on that.
Yeah, so and part of this is coming up because we are in the world of education even more broadly beyond Waldorf. I feel like we're all grappling with ways to help ourselves and our students understand history, understand diversity, understand cultural conflict, and we have so much to process in trying to find a path forward. And I feel like with lots of good intentions along the way, there are some mistakes being made, in those attempts to sort of come to grips and come to terms with some of these historical tensions and contemporary tensions. And I think you've already made a couple good points in terms of like, well, if we keep in mind some of these fundamental ideas about human development and what's developmentally appropriate, and we keep in mind some principles and values around not imposing judgments and leaving freedom for reflective judgment for people to make for themselves. Those are things that you find in Waldorf education that it should allow us to move through some of these difficult topics and conversations in a way that actually is healthier and more productive than a lot of other approaches that you're seeing out in the
Yeah.
world. Are there other things that come to mind for you or that you've been working with that you're seeing as problems or maybe mistakes that people are making or approaches to some of these difficult questions that just really they're not actually working as well as people want them to, and ways that we can sort of help course correct as we try to grapple with some of these big questions in education?
Very much so. I think that one of the biggest ones for me is multiculturalism. I think Waldorf has fallen behind in in the multiculturalizing, you could say, of the curriculum.
Mm-hmm.
If you look, I'm still trying to figure out in a little bit, in a certain way, what happened. It seemed to be quite present in the 1990s as an impulse,
Mm-hmm.
and then it seems to, my sense of it, just in terms of the literature, it seems to have fallen off and gone off the radar a little bit at that point. But yeah, I feel quite strongly that we don't have a strong enough multicultural curriculum, and there's many, many things that we can do to multiculturalize the curriculum. And one of the reasons I emphasize multiculturalism as opposed to, for example, something like decolonization is that multiculturalism doesn't have inherent judgments about anyone.
Hmm.
It sees all cultures in a positive light. And I think that's the appropriate place for younger kids,
Hmm.
that they see that every culture, and this is one of Steiner's ideals too, is that every culture has sort of like a gift to offer the rest of humanity.
Hmm.
And part of our project of becoming more human is the integration of these gifts, integrating them as much as possible.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
I think there's a lot we can do to like. I mean, one very simple place to start, of course, um, is the voyage of discovery block in grade seven, right? I remember teaching that in grade seven. I didn't include the indigenous point of view when I focused on that, but that's an obvious example where you know you're when you talk about the voyage of discovery block and how Western cultures began to explore the world, the pedagogical theme is discovery. And that
Hmm.
matches the grade seven child's
Hmm.
inner life, right? It meets their inner life in that way because much is being discovered as puberty is blooming. But of course, it also brings up the whole question of colonialism.
Hmm.
And so simply bringing the point of view and the worldview of the people that were eventually colonized um, is like an obvious place to start. And then you can build that like as you go through any historical um, project or inquiry, you can be having this sort of horizontal view. What was happening in the rest of the world at that time?
Hmm.
Um, and while not necessarily having, and by multiculturalizing, you don't have to, like in a history block, include everyone's point of view. Like you don't have to constantly be holding that, but it's something you can be touching into so that the children when they think of history, they have both a focused view on particular cultures, but also at the same time they have this broader view of the world itself and how it was developing. So it's just a little bit of an example of that, of how you can work with, and I think in particular, it's particularly important in schools that have children from a variety of cultures, right? Obviously. Now, the other thing in that stream of thinking is that Steiner picked out one subject that was particularly significant for what he called like a cosmopolitan ethos for children, and that's geography.
Hmm.
And he said geography stands out from every other block that you do. And it's a kind of integrative block where you pull on things you've learned from other blocks and integrate them. And you cultivate this cosmopolitan picture of humanity.
Hmm.
So again, I think, like for example, if I was teaching in school now, and I had in particular, if I do it anyway, but if I had kids from a variety of different cultures, I would be doing at least two geography blocks a year and really going because I think our times are calling for that. Our times we're facing an integration of cultures in a way that humanity has never really faced before, and it's creating all kinds of positive and negative things. And I think that's one way that Waldorf education can respond to that. And I imagine, particularly in the United States, where there's, in particular parts of the United States, this would be really relevant. So to really pick up geography as this moment, as Steiner indicated, of this moment of really working with a cosmopolitan picture, a multicultural picture of humanity. So the more we can present humanity itself as being that, and not just a reflection of ourselves,
Hmm.
that's I think of great benefit to children. And there's I think and those are just two examples, but I think you could go on that way of thinking
Yeah.
to almost every subject, right?
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that. I have found the study of geography to be something really special about Waldorf education. The way that we teach about culture and history through geography is
Yeah.
really beautiful and unique and important to keep. at our school right now in Kimberton, we're actually looking specifically at some of the things you mentioned, like looking at the middle school history and geography blocks and thinking about potential changes that we can make. And we have a recently retired teacher, Karen Height, who's coming back to work with our teachers on this because she's been really creative in thinking about the spirit and the essence of what these units and these developmental um, curriculum through the middle school is supposed to be bringing, and adaptations that you can bring to make sure that you're getting that multicultural sort of cross cultural view, but while being attuned to the underlying purpose of those blocks and the appropriateness of those blocks, right? Like one of the problems that we're facing in Waldorf education, I think, is the impulse to change is there in some places. The impulse to make it more diverse or multicultural or something is there, but not always with a clear understanding of what the underlying reason is for the way that it was the way it was. So that
Exactly.
careful to make sure any changes we make are still in alignment with those reasons and those purposes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's a good distinction between, and I think that's why Steiner talked
Mm,
specifically about geography having that
mm,
impulse and not necessarily history.
mm,
I think we can apply it to history, but the distinctive difference is that in historical change, the nature of human consciousness also changed. So there's a picture of the human story,
mm,
um, going from so grade five, you go back to the India, Persia, Egypt, Greece sequence, right?
mm,
So that's a little bit. I mean, that's it's one of the moments when anthroposophy comes a little closer and more apparent in the curriculum a little bit. I don't think
mm,
it penetrates into the curriculum as some people have criticized,
mm,
but what it does, the comparison of those modes of being tells us something about the nature of human beings and how human consciousness changes over time.
mm,
So I think you're right. We want to be really clear about our pedagogical goals. And as we multiculturalize them, you're right. We don't want to lose what the
mm,
essence of it is.
mm,
And that requires, a kind of literacy of anthroposophy for teachers. And that,
mm.
coming back to that concern that I have now of teachers who are untrained.
Yeah.
So, like you were saying, untrained teachers without a lot of guidance from experienced pedagogical direction will tend in that direction to just substitute things, right?
Mm,
And not be necessarily conscious of what might be being lost.
mm,
So, part of our task today in Waldorf education is to form. It's a phrase that I came up with. I call it a sort of cultural literacy of anthroposophy. You can get a kind of foundational sense of anthroposophy in terms of its foundational ideas, but that doesn't necessarily become a living thing. When you study anthroposophy, something interesting occurs. Um, you you find your doorway in. For me, it was the evolution of consciousness. As soon as I sort of was walking around anthroposophy for a while, and when the door came up that said evolution of consciousness, I went in that door pretty quickly. It was like that's my indoor. But
mm,
once you're inside, in a sense, what you're doing is you're piecing together for yourself a kind of literacy of what this whole worldview is. And inevitably in that process, you will start to form a kind of coherence, which will then come into crisis at a certain point when you try to integrate something else into it. You'll integrate something else, probably something a bit more esoteric, and this coherence that you've built up will be challenged. And what happens is you move through that challenge to a greater coherence. And that's the part that I hope that new Waldorf teachers can. One of my concerns is that when you meet that, you may find some coherent aspects about it, but you meet something that feels incoherent and then you abandon it. But really, that's a part of the process. So I think if teachers can be guided to uh, closely around how do you form this cultural literacy of anthroposophy without getting discouraged, that has real applications to your teaching.
Hmm.
because that means that you can stay focused on this picture of the human being at the center of things. And in this challenge of adapting the curriculum, we can I'm a total proponent of that. But the question about how to do it and what we very carefully have to not lose is the thing that actually gives Waldorf education its core identity. And that's that picture of the human being.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
we have in our development as teachers, we need to and even as parents who want to become more familiar with the kind of child development that is behind their child's education. I think we need to get better at forming that process and helping each other keep
Hmm.
focused on what the core identity of Waldorf education is.
Yeah. Yeah. And it seems to me that some of these key ideas and principles that we find in Waldorf really do speak very well and very clearly to some of the social cultural issues that we're facing in the world today. I'm wondering if in your work with teachers and maybe just with parents and people in general, do you find resistance or disagreement or confusion around some of these basic things like having to work through tensions and disagreements that arise from people having very different ideas about how things should be done? And if so, I'm wondering if you're experiencing that in your work with teachers, and if so, how you navigate that, and how you like what are the most helpful ways to sort of get through that or work through that with people, or to help somebody for whom they're coming from a very different place and they really
Mhm.
want to bring a certain, for instance, a certain brand of social justice to their kids for the sake of justice and goodness, but they're maybe not really understanding some of these underlying developmental pedagogical principles. Do you see that? How does that show up? And do you have ways of working with that? I'm wondering.
Yeah, definitely for sure. I've had some just through this last year, I've given a number of workshops with teachers and that definitely comes up. So one of the things, one of the ideas that I think is helpful in working through this, what you just described, is when it comes to uh, social justice principles and approaches, there's something happening. To form an approach to social justice, it's a combination of um, a moral impulse or a moral principle. So justice is a moral principle, right?
Mhm.
And or empathy, you could say. And and so it's a combination of that moral principle with an interpretation of what the root causes of that injustice is. That's what makes it a social justice question, not just a justice question,
Mhm.
right? Most justice questions are solved in the political sphere around rights and equality. And we've seen that through the 20th century that most of the progress that's made in social justice is through the universalization of human rights.
Mhm.
But when, excuse me, um, what's happening now is that this where we all agree is on the moral impulse. We actually all want to act morally around issues of social justice. Where the conversation is what is the interpretation of the root causes? And what's happening at the moment that's problematic and divisive is that the current approach, which I call critical social justice, it's influenced by critical theory and postmodern thinking. Critical social justice looks at the social theories. It proposes certain social theories that define what the root causes are, but they look at those social theories as if they are moral principles. The moral principle and the social theory become unified and bound together. So if you question the social theory, it's like a moral transgression.
Mhm. Mhm.
So if I say, for example, one of them, for example, is that gender is a social construct. So if I'm quite sensitive to the kind of explosion of gender dysphoria that's happening with young people, and I'm trying to learn more about transgenderism, but I don't actually agree that gender itself can be reduced down to um, can be looked at as something separate from from your biological sex, for example. If you have that point of view, just having that point of view is a moral transgression.
mm,
And I think that's where everything's getting clogged up, is that we're unable now to assess the progressiveness of these social theories
mm,
because they've become morally bound to
mhm,
the impulse behind it.
mm,
So for me, the conversation is we actually need to separate those things and look at the current critical social justice sort of menu of language and terminology and understand it as a set of social theories
mm,
that inevitably we're going to have different points of view around.
mhm, mm,
And that's I think the conversation that isn't happening
mhm,
and is causing a kind of tension. Now, in my experience, and I experience this almost every workshop I've given, I have a very particular experience when I bring up that point. And inevitably, someone who's a very strong advocate of critical social justice approach will will put up their hand and they'll say, as one teacher recently said to me, "What do you think we're doing? We're just We're just acting through empathy." And she gave an example of how in her class there was a child whose family became homeless, and so the teacher took up a pedagogical story about, a squirrel that lost its home, etc. So that's a whole Waldorf approach, a pedagogical story.
mhm,
And then she looked at me and I said, "Well, that's a great example of how Waldorf can can approach some of these justice and how when they impact children directly like that."
mhm,
But what the tendency is to look at is, again, so that's an example, right? So what that person was doing, saying, we're just acting out of a moral impulse.
mhm,
And it was very difficult for this person to see that, yes, you are acting out of a moral impulse. That's actually true. But what you're doing is you're attaching the way in which you're acting on that moral impulse is being defined by the social theories you've adopted.
mhm,
So let's talk about that. And that is what I'm finding is that there's a strong discouragement to do that.
mhm,
And I think that's because in most people's minds, those theories have risen up into like sort of moral platitudes. And you actually can't do that.
mhm,
So that's one area but I think we can make a lot of progress is to honestly identify them as a set of theories. And that can be scrutinized. And in fact, this principle of truth seeking, if we're going to, and I think this is a very strong anthroposophical tenet, right, is that we pursue, we seek truth through objectivity, through that diversity of viewpoint. It's not just a political idea that everybody should have their point of view, but it's a deeper impulse in that as other people's points of view are brought in, everyone's thinking can change and deepen from that variety of point of view. And so that deepening into the question isn't really happening. And I think that's the big step to take is to understand why that isn't happening. And that gets us into a little bit of a picture of, and so that, to figure out why that's not happening gets us into a deeper understanding of the sort of philosophical basis of where that's coming from. And luckily, I find with anthroposophy and its notion of social threefolding, I've found in my work it is very, very insightful to help us understand the nature of that way of thinking. Because so there's two problems here. One is that we don't actually understand the nature of critical social justice thinking very well. We don't have a kind of cultural literacy of it yet, partially because we're kind of herded into positions that out of the moral impulse as opposed to the real reflecting on, what do these theories say about a human being? What does it say about the nature of society? So there's that problem. And then in anthroposophy in general, we don't have a cultural literacy of social threefolding. we don't have our own social justice philosophy worked out and practices that come out of that philosophy worked out. So we're kind of in two voids. I would add a third void in that we don't actually have a strong enough cultural literacy of anthroposophy itself. So we don't understand anthroposophy well enough. We don't understand the contribution that anthroposophy can make to social health. And we don't have a strong understanding of the new theories that are driving us in a certain direction. And I think doing that kind of work with teachers I have found a lot of appreciation because once you look at it that way, you kind of get a feeling for something that you haven't necessarily been able to put into words yet. Why is there such tension around this? Why am I feeling pressure to adopt a point of view um, that uh, that seems so important, but yet my own thinking hasn't caught up with it yet? So the approach to dealing with these, I think, is helping people present it in such a way that people can begin thinking it through for themselves and not reaching a conclusion that I've reached or anyone reaches, but what's your own individual assessment of these social theories? And we're not doing all that.
We're not, but we're striving through conversations like this because that was a very helpful and really excellent explanation of some of these tensions and underlying dynamics that we're seeing really all around us. And my hope is that we can forge a shared understanding and a sense of shared values that are rooted in anthroposophy and Waldorf pedagogy that help us navigate some of this terrain. Because my sense is that part of the issue
Yeah.
too is it's that people are pressured to align with or conform to certain approaches, certain ways of even using language based on identity groups, because we have this sort of underlying need to have a shared identity. And because we're sort of fractured, sort of culturally and socially, and we're sort of polarized into these identity groups, we tend to go along with the language and words and concepts of whatever group we identify with. And we don't have enough shared understanding to sort of be grounded in either just a human identity or in some particular set of values and principles, like for instance those related to those that you're bringing forward that come forward through Waldorf and anthroposophy. So at least within the context of Waldorf schools and communities, what I would love to see is developing more of this shared understanding of the worldview and the values and the principles that we're operating from that are grounded in what it means to be a human being, because then from
Mhm.
there we can change the dynamics of the conversation and not just fall into these identity traps of falling into like either a left or a right or a red or a blue sort of orientation, right? We have to get
Yeah.
out of those frames and shift the context so that the conversation is shifted where we're oriented toward these values and principles that are connected to human development and to pedagogy and to learning and to becoming a free thinking human, as opposed to the sort of default frames that we're given that relate more to like an us versus them on the political spectrum side of things. And I feel like
Yeah.
it's hard for people to make clear distinctions, but we have to reground in a new kind of language and a new kind of thinking that sort of regrounds us in just what it means to be a human being. And not only that, but a developing and growing human being.
Yes. And so, so what, from an anthroposophical point of view, social injustice is a symptom of the lack of social health.
Mm-hmm,
So social threefolding is a way to organize society in a healthy manner.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
So and generally, critical social justice tends to look at as just social justice needs exists, but it sort of needs to be stamped out and
mm-hmm,
controlled, and
mm-hmm,
inevitably that'll come through the power of the state, right?
mm-hmm,
To control that.
mm-hmm,
Um, but it doesn't carry, that I can see anyway, it doesn't carry an inherent wise picture of a social form that is inherently just. And I think that's what social threefolding brings. So that's one of the downsides of the critical social justice approach is that so there is no picture from of social health that isn't working and therefore creating social injustice. It's just something that is in particular the nature of dominant groups that
Yeah.
just simply needs to be controlled or suppressed if it doesn't voluntarily confess itself. So that's a bit of a problem. And so the underlying thing that's going on there, and again, this is an insight that comes from social threefolding. So one of Steiner's most brilliant insights into social health is that in these three spheres of politics, culture, and economy, if one of those spheres tries to dominate the other, that's the fundamental source of injustice. So what we saw, so let's start with capitalism where we all live. So capitalism is a system where the economic sphere attempts to dominate the political sphere and and reorganize the political sphere in such a way that it gets what it needs, and it also draws on the freedom from the cultural sphere uh, to claim freedoms that it actually doesn't actually have. So it claims the freedom. So it wants a freedom without any social responsibility. So fundamentally, there's a problem there with capitalism, and then with the state socialism point of view that came to life really in Steiner's time with the Bolshevik Revolution, is that the rights sphere will dominate the economy, and it'll bring equality from that realm into the economic sphere, which of course historically played out that it wasn't actually able to do.
Hmm.
And Steiner predicted that when you do that, bringing rights into the economic sphere is not a healing agent for the problem of class struggle in the economic sphere. It actually will just create new problems. And I think that point of view has historically played out quite dramatically, right?
Yeah.
So what we see now with the whole postmodern turn that came with the 80s and 90s is again the rights sphere is not has sort of looked at its attempt in the economic sphere and recognized that there's a certain problem, but
Hmm.
oh, there's this other sphere that where rights and equality hasn't come to dominate yet. So it went into the cultural sphere,
Hmm.
and it's trying to dominate the cultural sphere by bringing rights into it. So issues of racism and gender and colonization and education are the focus of the current critical social justice thinking. And underlying it is this dynamic of we're going to take issues that whose healing agent is freedom, and we're going to replace it with rights. And
Yeah.
so the problem with that is you the only way you can do that is through coercion.
Hmm.
And that comes links back to the conversations we're having when people are having these conversations in schools and whatnot. There's an inner feeling of coercion.
Hmm. Hmm.
You're being, and one of the ways this occurs is, and you may have heard of this, is the essentialism relativity binary that
Hmm.
all social justice issues are brought to us through from critical social justice. Nothing can be essential. Everything has to be relative. And if you're not noticing that everything is framed in that binary from the very beginning, then you enter into a way of thinking that's very difficult to think through for yourself.
Hmm. Hmm.
And the only way to uh, the only way to make progress in bringing rights into the cultural sphere is through that kind of coercive
Hmm.
element. You see this manifesting in a lot of different ways, like Ibram X. Kendi's article in The Atlantic back in 2019 when he offered this idea that there should be a sort of critical race theory council above all power structures within the United States that determines what's racist and not racist and has the power to to change that completely.
Hmm.
At one level, it sounds like, oh, great, that'll eliminate racism, right? But if you look at it from a social threefolding point of view, you're saying that the state is going to have this, you're giving a huge amount of power to state actors, right? To act in the cultural sphere. So one of the things that, so here's a little concept that I like to capstone this kind of conversation is that there's a difference between revolutionizing social power and transforming social power. Anthroposophy brings a picture of social transformation through this separation into independent spheres. Um, and uh, and revolutionizing social power is really about one of those three spheres dominating the other, whether it's rights dominating the economy or dominating the cultural sphere, as we see in postmodern thinking, or in capitalism, we see this um, lack of boundaries and bringing the state, like in neoliberalism, is basically where the state becomes a complete servant of the economic realm, the corporate interests, and and taking all kinds of freedoms that is inappropriate for the business world to have.
Mhm.
So you can kind of get a sense. I guess I'm trying to give a sense, a little
Yeah.
bit of some of the insights that can be brought into the conversation from social threefolding. Yeah.
Yeah, I really think that there is great potential for some of the key insights and ideas of social threefolding to be relevant and helpful for folks. I mean, one thing that came up for me as an example of this sort of overlapping and conflating different ideas and not having clear distinctions between them, I think we see, for instance, in the confusion around the difference between equal opportunity and equal outcomes, for instance, right? And
Mhm.
some
Exactly.
notions of
Yeah.
equity, that this is something I've been trying to help people
Mhm.
understand over the last few years, is some ways that we talk about equity, we slide into talking about equal outcomes, right? As though we want
Yeah.
everyone to achieve the same thing without really thinking through how literally impossible that is and how
Yeah.
you cannot coerce and force all people to end up in the same place at the same time, really on anything. Like where we really are individuals and we really have to be free and we have to allow for inevitable inequality of outcomes. We just have to make sure that people are treated fairly and equitably and opportunity is as equal as possible. And we're still striving
Mhm.
for these ideals. There's so many good ideals that we can strive for that relate to equality and equity, but we can't ever conflate these totally separate realms, right? And that's just another example. And I think another thing that was coming up for me as you were talking is just making sure that we are clear about the basic principles that we're operating from and that we're not violating them in a sort
Yeah.
of ends justify the means approach too. I think that's another trap that some folks in social justice spheres are falling into, is this notion that like the only answer to racism is more racism or something like that. Like if you're violating your own principles and you're having a performative contradiction in what you're doing, it's a sign that you've gotten off the path and you need to slow down, come back to first principles, think about the values and principles and ideas that you're grounded in, and make sure that you're in alignment with that. And we just really need more clear thinking about some of these things. And having an orienting framework like threefolding is very helpful because it helps us think more clearly about some of these distinctions to help keep us on course and keep us from contradicting ourselves and violating some of our own intentions, right? We don't want to violate um, notions of freedom and being non-coercive as we go about trying to make the world a better and more just place.
Yeah. And you see this in, I see it at a couple of places in modern literature where, particularly in 1984, in George Orwell's work in 1984, and particularly in Animal Farm. And it's this beautiful image of a revolution in which nothing is transformed.
Mm,
And that, I mean, there's times I think that George Orwell must have read Steiner
mm,
because that's exactly what Steiner said, right? You can dominate another sphere and revolutionize power, but there's the strong risk that nothing will fundamentally change.
mm.
And it shows up again in Tolkien in The Lord of the Rings, which is a book that I wrote. I wrote a book called
Yeah.
Tolkien's Hidden Pictures.
Mhm,
And one of the thoughts that I've developed, from doing that book was like wearing the ring is a kind of revolutionary power.
mm,
And so the evil forces of Middle-earth are around tempting you to wear the ring.
mm,
And if when you wear the ring, you assume the power, kind of revolutionary power. You can go in, you've centralized the power in yourself, and you can go in and change a problem from outside, right?
mm, mm,
But not wearing the ring and transforming or destroying the ring leads to the transformation of power. A healthy alignment returns to Middle Earth when
mm,
that power is taken out and transformed. So it's an interesting idea that I think is living in people in different ways, right? That and I find it a really good. We tend to think of social change as having to be revolutionary, but I think we're now at a place where there's enough resources in our culture now to begin to think, to reflect, wait a minute, when when power when power is revolutionized, things change, but positive things don't necessarily come about from it, right? And I think that's where this notion of the difference between, for me, revolutionizing power is this domination of one sphere over another, like Steiner indicated. One of the other things I would add, just on your point about the difference on the question of equity, the notion of systemic racism is I think built on this notion of the inequality of outcomes, right? And so just to touch base with that a little bit, from a threefolding point of view, race and identity kind of lives in the cultural sphere. But one of the reasons that we have this notion of systemic racism is because, in a way, what originated in the cultural sphere has infected all three spheres. So there's some social justice issues that are that are complex in that way. And I think a threefolding lens helps us to see the complexity of racism
Mhm.
without necessarily having to rely on a notion of systemic racism that's fundamentally based on statistics and how statistical information is formed and the possible reduction of causal factors within those statistics, right? Which I think is how the current understanding of systemic racism
Yeah. And
is
also, I
built
think
on.
just tremendous assumptions about causal factors by just looking at outcomes, right? Like coming to
Yeah,
conclusions about the reasons for outcomes without actually looking more
yeah,
closely and carefully at the specific context.
yeah. So in the cultural realm, racism uh, operates at two levels, at an individual level and a collective level. But what's happening for racism to occur, what's happening is the projection of shadow. And individuals can project shadows, but the really big danger, and I think for me, this is where I think the biggest conversation needs to happen, particularly around the racism question, is racism manifests as the projection of collective shadow. And when that happens, the other spheres get swamped with the effects of racism, and racism lives everywhere. But one of the reasons that I think social threefolding is helpful with that question is that it understands particularly how racism is manifesting within a particular sphere. And the healing agent for each sphere is already determined. So we can approach this notion of, I would move away from saying systemic racism and saying more the complexity of racism is very, very profound. And when it's a collective shadow projection, it becomes like a kind of social disease, right? Because it infects and when it affects the economic realm, that has repercussions that worsen effects in the other realms. So even in these really complex social justice issues, the social threefolding framework, I think, is helpful. And primarily because it identifies what the healing agent is. So the healing agent in the cultural realm now is working with shadow. And that gets us into the notion of unconscious bias, right? So largely unconscious bias work now tends to be a kind of, well, your shadows are already determined by your group identity. And it's really kind of a matter of owning up to them. And when we do that, we we kind of water it down, and there isn't a real inner self-discovery that occurs of where I'm actually not as free from that bias as I thought I was. And that's the important work. And Steiner's idea of ethical individualism, I think, is the way in which we counter shadow projection, both at an individual and a collective level. Because as soon as you look at other human beings from other ethnicities or genders or whatever as just a human being, that thwarts the shadow projection. It's the key in which you can um, you can yeah, thwart. I'm not thinking of a better word, but thwart or come to an understand, come to out of your own experience that, oh, I have a shadow that I'm projecting,
Mhm.
right? But there's an, again, because it's in the cultural realm, there's an element of freedom that has to occur in that self journey to make it actually authentic. Because I can easily say, oh yeah, I have all this shadow projection because of my group identities. I'm male, I'm white, et cetera, and then like check the box off and go
Mhm.
on, right?
Yeah,
Without the actual core um, cause of racism really being dealt with.
yeah, yeah. Wow, Mark. Um, I'm a little bit blown away by the depth
So,
and clarity of
cult,
insight.
collective shadow projection. I mean, just look at historically where
Hmm.
in the Holocaust brought us was the Holocaust was impossible without collective shadow projection.
Hmm.
So we get into understanding now how that is built up because forces there have to be forces at play that consciously build up that collective shadow projection.
Hmm.
And that's
Why?
another testament to the fact that we're not slaves to our group identity. I, as a white male, I could come up with insights about how that is occurring
Hmm.
just out of my humanity. And I don't, and because I'm white and male doesn't mean I'm blind to
Yeah.
that, nor not willing to thwart that.
Yeah. Well, I think another thing I see, which is quite prevalent, is that those who identify as being for social justice and anti-racist and good in all kinds of ways, um, it's possible to project shadow onto the big bad other and not do that internal shadow work oneself, right? And we're actually,
Exactly,
it's
exactly.
actually the most righteous amongst us who need to really slow down and look in the mirror and do that individual work, because we really, each individual, no one is exempt from having to do this work and this shadow work and really owning our own biases and owning our own shortcomings and not just being on the side of the righteous. And the mistake that we perpetually make is seeing ourselves on the side of the good and then projecting the bad onto the other, and then
Mhm.
we're actually just perpetuating and recreating the problem as opposed to healing it.
Yeah, and just think of the social power that is accrued through the formation of a collective shadow projection. Like,
Yeah.
look, that's where the
Very
power of the
powerful.
Nazis came from.
Yeah.
That's where the power of the Bolsheviks came from, and the
Yeah.
Maoists, like the real totalitarians. That's what they do. Their secret is that they cultivate the projection of collective shadow, and that unleashes a huge amount of power
Yeah. Well, I think
for people.
in the two primary polarized identity groups in our culture, we see both sides sort of doing that in different ways, sort of
Yeah.
project shadow onto the other side. And each of us as
Yeah.
individuals has to take responsibility for not perpetuating that and not feeding into that. Um,
To bring it back to Waldorf education, again, that's the beautiful thing about it is it looks at each child as an individual
hmm. Hmm.
and not just it doesn't separate them into groups.
Yeah.
Um, each child is looked at as an individual, and their development, their inner development as an individual is
Yeah.
the primary focus, right? So one of the other philosophies that I find in critical social justice potentially really harmful is this notion of the social construct. And if you look into that way of thinking, it goes right back into Marxism. Marx's ideas that, the proletariat is and humanity are historical constructs, right? And that's a materialistic way of thinking about the human being that really change and a healthy society is determined from the outside and not from the inside. And that's the big switch that Steiner makes, is that social health is ultimately founded on individual freedom. And that's because that's the only way that humans can actually act or become moral people not just act in a particular way, but actually become moral people is through inner development,
Hmm. Hmm.
not through the imposing of certain social structures on them or codes or whatnot. So again, that's what Waldorf education
Yeah.
does.
Yeah, it's so
Attempts
key.
to,
And one, final thought from me here is just I feel like a lot of the principles and ideas that you're sharing, they're central to Waldorf education, but they're also not um not limited to or by that. Like
yes,
these are just universal human truths and insights that we can come to on our own
yeah,
just through thinking, right? And we don't need to create a separate group or category called anthroposophy or Waldorf thinking, right? And like, I don't want us to be kept there. I want us to really,
yeah,
those of us who are in these conversations, in these communities, to really see and acknowledge that these are really relevant and insightful ideas for everyone, and that we can
yeah.
really bring these forward in the world in our Waldorf communities, but not limited to that or by that. Simply because.
I totally agree. Yeah. And just coming back to that first thought about the integration, that's one way to do that is in other school systems,
Mhm,
where are you integrating those three
mhm.
pedagogical ideas?
Yeah,
And because when you integrate them, you get into this holistic thinking about the child.
yeah,
And it keeps you from just these are all separate subjects that have these external markers for competence.
yeah.
But when they're integrated, the child has a different experience
Mhm,
of
mhm.
learning than they
Yeah,
do when they're seen as external categories of knowledge that just need to be checked off in terms of your level of competence,
yeah.
right?
Yeah, no, these things are relevant to everyone. And I think,
Yeah.
my part of my work and what I want all of us to be striving for is to keep finding ways to bring these ideas and these insights to a broader audience so that we're getting out of just the Waldorf world and really helping to spread some of these ideas because the culture and society that we're living in are very much in need of this kind of thinking and this kind of healing that you're really bringing in what you're sharing. So thank you.
Well, you're welcome,
Um,
Brad. A pleasure to
that
talk with
said,
you.
yeah, is there any final thoughts you want to leave us with in terms of, yeah, final thoughts or advice for parents or teachers or anything that you want to plug for yourself?
Um, I think uh, I think parents should really be included in the question of curriculum adaptation because the parents have an image of what a Waldorf school is that they want for their child, and they're bringing that forward. And their role in the school is quite pronounced. Most even alternative schools don't have such a sort of participatory gesture towards the parent body.
Hmm.
So I think if adaptation is changing, then the picture of what the parent is holding of their child's education and what's actually happening might start growing out of sync. So a real inclusion of parents in in that, not in the sense that we're all going to vote about on a particular adaptation, but I think there's a responsibility on the part of schools to show that if they're going to engage in adaptations, which I think is uh, definitely we should be doing, that if you're going to do that, you need to be able to show how this more spiritual view of human development in the child is still at the center.
Hmm.
Because
Hmm.
that's for me like the anchor. Because
Hmm.
if we pull up the anchor from that, there's a lot of drift can occur.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so I think parents have a right to hear that adaptations come out of the spirit of that core identity of Waldorf education. Um, as the child is a spiritual being incarnating
Hmm.
into the earth, and that's what childhood is for. It's why humans have childhood and mammals essentially don't, because
Hmm.
they need that longer period of time to incarnate.
Yeah,
And then animals don't have a spirit incarnating, so they're up and
yeah,
running, you know.
yeah, yeah.
But I
Well,
think that's the role of parents.
yeah, and I agree with that impulse. And as the head of a school, that's a bit of a challenge to me, right? Because
For sure.
it's hard to figure out how to enact that. But
Yeah.
I actually just I just recently sent out a survey to all of our parents to get some input into a self-study that we're doing. So
Yeah.
he's taking
And
some gentle steps in that direction. But I totally
yeah,
agree that we want to cultivate relationships between parents and schools and really re-empower, but also that involves partly an education of parents as well. Like we need to actually have uh,
yes,
an educational community that includes the education of all the adults in the community, not just training teachers, but also educating parents so that we're all on the same page and having more of the
totally.
kind of rich conversations that you and I are having. And that's actually part of the
Yeah,
purpose of this podcast is having conversations like this that are percolating out throughout the family so that they're more tuned in and informed by and able to participate in those kinds of conversations.
totally. Good work, Brad.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. I really, really appreciate it. And it's
It was
just
great chatting with you.
what. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Mhm.